I stood utterly frozen, a block of ice on my own porch, as the Sheriff Brody, contemptuously nailed an eviction notice right onto my front door. Beside him, Richard Sterling, the smug HOA president, smirked, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. Through a nasty web of bribery and outright corruption, they'd managed to legally seize a chunk of my land, or so they thought. What these small-town tyrants hadn't bothered to discover, however, was that my father's badge carried significantly more weight than theirs ever would. I could only imagine the looks on their faces, pure, unadulterated shock, when they finally realized the chief of police from the neighboring county was about to crash their meticulously orchestrated land grab. "Get those disgusting vegetables out of my sight line!" Barbara Sterling screamed, her voice shrill enough to shatter glass, echoing over the fence dividing our properties. Her perfectly manicured fingernails, painted a garish shade of pink, dug into the wooden slats until her knuckles went bone white. Confused by her sudden, venomous outburst, I looked up from my kneeling position beside my burgeoning tomato plants, the rich, dark earth still fresh under my nails. "These tomato plants are well within my property line, Barbara," I explained, trying to keep my voice calm as I wiped a bead of sweat tracing a path through the dirt on my forehead. "They aren't hurting anyone." "They're an eyesore, Roger," she spat, apparently confusing me with her husband in her fury. "Richard and I paid far too much for this house to be subjected to looking at your pathetic little farmer's market experiment." Slowly, deliberately, I rose to my feet, brushing clinging soil from my jeans. This wasn't our first skirmish over my garden, not by a long shot. But Barbara seemed particularly unhinged today. Her perfectly coiffed, almost unnaturally still blonde hair barely moved an inch as she physically shook with rage. "The HOA rules explicitly state I can grow vegetables in my backyard, Barbara," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the frustration simmering inside me. My garden wasn't just dirt and plants. It was my sanctuary, my peace after long, draining days at work. When my mother passed away last year, tending these vegetables, each plant painstakingly grown from seed she had saved over decades, became my therapy, my connection to her. "Rules," she hissed, her voice dripping with menace, "can change." With that parting shot, she spun on her heel and stormed back into her enormous, ostentatious house. I turned back to my precious plants, the vibrant green leaves seeming to wilt slightly under the weight of her threat. I tried to shake off the unease settling in my stomach. My garden was more than just a hobby, it was a living legacy. I wasn't about to rip out my mother's memory just because Barbara Sterling craved a more Instagram-worthy view from her pristine patio. The very next morning, my unease solidified into cold dread, stabbed violently into my front lawn, like a declaration of war, was a bright yellow notice. Property violation, unauthorized garden extension. I yanked it out, my hands trembling slightly as I read the utterly ridiculous claims that my modest garden somehow extended 3 whole feet into community property. It was a blatant lie. From across the street, I noticed my neighbor, Kevin Miller, watching me, concern etched plainly on his face. He jogged over, casting a nervous glance back toward the Sterling's house. "They actually did it," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "Richard called an emergency HOA meeting last night. Just him and his cronies were invited, nobody else." "They can't just decide my property line moved overnight," I exclaimed, incredulity warring with rising anger. My hands were definitely shaking now. "There's more," Kevin continued, lowering his voice even further, leaning in conspiratorially. "I overheard Richard on the phone with Sheriff Brody yesterday. Something about making the problem property available and then he mentioned generous campaign contributions. My stomach plummeted. Richard Sterling, as HOA president, wielded considerable influence throughout Pinecrest Heights. Sheriff Brody's re-election campaign signs were practically ubiquitous, littering lawns across the neighborhood, including a particularly large, gaudy one planted squarely in Richard and Barbara's perfectly manicured yard. The pieces were clicking together with horrifying speed. "Thanks for the warning, Kevin," I managed, folding the offensive yellow notice and shoving it into my pocket. Inside, my heart pounding, I pulled out my property documents. The deed, the official survey maps, everything clearly showed the garden was entirely within my boundaries. I meticulously took photos of the garden beds, the property markers sunk into the ground years ago, and the offending notice. Then, composing myself, I emailed them all to the HOA's official address with a firmly worded response, refuting their claims and demanding they retract the violation notice immediately. The reply arrived within minutes, chillingly swift and impersonal. "The board has reviewed updated land surveys provided by Mr. Sterling. Your documentation is outdated. Correct the violation within 48 hours or face penalties, including fines and forced removal." Outdated? My survey was from when I inherited the house. Panic began to bubble in my chest. I called my lawyer immediately, leaving a frantic message. While pacing anxiously, waiting for him to call back, I heard the rumble of a large truck pulling up outside. My blood ran cold as I saw men in generic work uniforms pouring out, heading straight for my garden. I raced outside, planting myself between them and my tomatoes. "Stop! What do you think you're doing?" Predictably, Richard Sterling emerged from behind the truck, a clipboard clutched in his hand like a scepter. "Enforcement of HOA violations, as permitted in the covenant you signed when you bought the property," he stated, his tone dripping with false authority. "You can't just take my land," I protested, my voice rising despite my efforts to control it. I stood my ground, a lone figure against the tide. "Actually," Richard replied, a chillingly thin smile spreading across his face that didn't reach his cold eyes, "we can. It appears it's not your land anymore. The updated survey clearly shows this portion belongs to the community." "What updated survey?" I demanded, aghast. "I was never notified of any new survey. You can't just change property lines without due process." "It was mentioned in the monthly newsletter," he smirked, clearly enjoying my distress. "Not my fault if you don't bother to read community updates." The lie was so blatant, so audacious, it momentarily stunned me. Just then, my phone buzzed. My lawyer. "Don't let them touch anything." His voice was sharp, urgent. "Don't sign anything. I'm on my way right now." "My lawyer says you need to leave immediately," I told Richard, trying desperately to project a confidence I didn't feel. He actually laughed, a short, barking sound devoid of humor. "Your lawyer can take it up with Sheriff Brody. He's fully aware of our actions here today and completely supports them." As if summoned by his words, a patrol car cruised slowly down the street and pulled up behind the work truck. Sheriff Brody stepped out, thumbs hooked casually in his belt loops, projecting an air of bored authority. He gave Richard a curt nod before sauntering over to me. "We've had some complaints about a disturbance," he drawled, his gaze dismissive, though it was obvious no one but Richard had called. "They are trying to steal part of my property," I explained, holding out my deed, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "This is illegal. Look at the official plat map." The sheriff barely glanced at the documents I thrust towards him. "Looks like an internal HOA matter to me," he said, dismissively waving a hand. "They have the authority within the covenants to enforce their rules on community property." Behind him, horrifyingly, the workers began their destruction. With callous indifference, they started ripping out my precious tomato plants. the ones grown from Mom's seeds, tossing her living legacy into large plastic trash bags like common garbage. Across the street, I saw Barbara Sterling watching from her pristine picture window, phone held up, undoubtedly recording my humiliation for the neighborhood gossip group she moderated. "Those plants, they're special," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "They were my mother's. Please, at least let me transplant them." "Should have thought about that before you decided to break the rules," Richard replied coolly, making a checkmark on his clipboard, sealing the plant's fate. Something inside me snapped. A lifetime of being taught to handle my own problems, to stand on my own 2 feet, warred with the blatant injustice unfolding before my eyes. I hadn't called my father for help since I moved here after college. He'd raised me to be independent, but as Sheriff Brody stood there, radiating smug indifference so clearly in Richard Sterling's pocket, I realized this fight was rapidly escalating beyond something I could handle alone. This required family reinforcement. Retreating numbly back inside my house, the sounds of destruction following me, I picked up my phone with trembling hands. I dialed the number I knew by heart. "Dad? It's me. I need your help." My voice broke. "Remember how you always said there comes a time when you have to recognize a fight is bigger than yourself? I think I'm there." "What's happened?" His voice, calm and steady, instantly carried the ingrained authority of 15 years as chief of police in the neighboring, much larger Riverdale County. Tears blurring my vision, I choked out the story. "The HOA, they're seizing part of my property. It's all lies, Dad. They've bribed the local sheriff, Brody. They're outside right now, destroying Mom's garden." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes, a heavy, assessing quiet. Finally, he said, his voice dangerously low, "Take photos. Get video of everything. Record any conversations you can, safely. Don't sign anything. I'll be there tomorrow morning." After hanging up, emotionally drained, I noticed an email notification blinking on my screen. Subject line, Community Improvement Project Announcement. My blood turned to ice as I read the message. It detailed ambitious plans for a significant neighborhood enhancement project impacting several properties, including the precise slice of land they were currently stealing from me. Attached, like a final twist of the knife, was an architectural rendering. Sleek, modern, luxury condominiums positioned exactly where my house and several of my neighbors' homes currently stood. I stared at the screen, numb with shock. This was never about my garden. It was never about vegetables or property lines or HOA rules. They wanted my entire property. They wanted to erase my home. Through the window, I watched Sheriff Brody shake hands warmly with Richard Sterling before climbing back into his patrol car and driving away, leaving the destruction in his wake. The workers had finished decimating my garden and were now methodically hammering stakes into the ground, marking out a new, fraudulent property line that sliced away nearly a quarter of my yard. Kevin appeared beside them, pretending to admire their work, but I saw him discreetly taking pictures with his phone. Our eyes met briefly through the window. He gave an almost imperceptible nod before casually walking away. I looked down at my phone, my father's contact information still displayed. What Richard Sterling, Barbara Sterling, and Sheriff Brody didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that they had picked the absolute worst house, the absolute wrong family to target. Tomorrow, they were going to learn exactly who my father was. And this seemingly simple, petty garden dispute was about to explode into something far bigger, far more dangerous than any of them were prepared for. But tonight, I had research to do. If they wanted war, I needed ammunition. "Is your dad really the chief of police?" Kevin whispered, his voice hushed with a mixture of awe and disbelief as we huddled in my kitchen the next morning. The aroma of stale fear seemed to linger in the air. Through the window, we could see Richard Sterling already outside, imperiously directing a surveyor who was placing even more stakes deep into my violated yard, claiming yet more ground that wasn't his. 20 years in law enforcement, 15 as chief in Riverdale County, I confirmed grimly, sliding my laptop across the table towards him. The screen glowed with the fruits of my frantic, sleepless night of research. "Look what I found last night." Kevin's eyes widened as he scrolled through the documents I'd unearthed from obscure county websites and planning board archives, property assessments, blatant zoning change requests filed just weeks ago, permit applications. "Wait a second, is that Richard Sterling's signature on a development contract with Maplewood Developers?" I nodded, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. "The HOA isn't just trying to take my garden, Kevin. They're systematically trying to force out half the neighborhood for some massive, lucrative development deal." As if on cue, the doorbell rang. A sharp, jarring sound that made us both jump, nearly out of our skins. Peeking through the peephole, I saw a uniformed delivery person holding a large, official-looking envelope. The return address belonged to the HOA's management company. "Legal papers already?" Kevin asked, his brow furrowed with worry as I signed for the package, my hand unsteady. I tore it open, my eyes scanning the dense legalese. My breath hitched. "It's worse," I breathed, sinking onto a kitchen chair. "It's a cease and desist order. They're claiming I'm interfering with legitimate HOA business simply by documenting their actions. They're threatening to put a lien on my house if I don't stop." "They can't do that," Kevin protested, outraged. "They shouldn't be able to," I agreed, feeling a wave of despair wash over me. "But look who signed off on it." Kevin leaned closer, peering at the imposing signature at the bottom. "Sheriff Brody? He can't enforce HOA rules like this. It's a civil matter." "He apparently can if they've managed to convince a judge, likely through more backroom deals, that their fraudulent new property lines are legitimate," I said, feeling trapped. "My lawyer says we need to counterfile immediately, get an injunction, but that could take days, even weeks." Just then, the deep rumble of a powerful engine filled the air. A large, dark SUV pulled decisively into my driveway. My heart leaped into my throat as my father stepped out. Even out of his usual jurisdiction, he was still wearing his chief's uniform, the crisp fabric and polished badge radiating an aura of indisputable authority. He surveyed the scene, the stakes mocking my property line, Richard Sterling conferring with the surveyor with the kind of cold, calculated gaze that had undoubtedly intimidated hardened criminals for decades. "Don't tell anyone who he is yet," I whispered urgently to Kevin. "Not Richard, not the surveyor. We need to understand exactly what their game plan is first." Dad entered the house without knocking, his commanding presence instantly filling the small kitchen. He gave me a brief, strong hug before turning his keen attention to the papers spread across my table. "Kevin's been helping me," I explained quickly. "He lives across the street and saw some of what happened." Dad nodded respectfully to Kevin, a silent acknowledgement before focusing entirely on me. "Show me everything," he said, his voice low and steady. "Start from the very beginning." For the next hour, we laid out the entire sordid story. The initial, seemingly petty garden dispute with Barbara, the sudden, suspicious survey changes, Sheriff Brody's blatant complicity, the workers destroying Mum's legacy, and finally, the chilling development plans I'd uncovered, revealing the true scope of their avarice. "Classic land grab," Dad concluded, his expression darkening, his jaw tight. "They're using the HOA the covenants, everything, as a flimsy cover for a predatory real estate scheme. But why target me first? I asked. The question that had been tormenting me. Why me specifically? Corner properties like yours are extremely valuable for development, Dad explained patiently, pointing to my plot on the old survey map. Your lot gives them crucial street access on two sides. Plus, his eyes held a flicker of sympathy. They probably profiled you. Living alone, no family nearby they knew of, they thought you'd be an easy target. He paused, a grim edge to his voice. Except they didn't know about me. A commotion outside drew our attention. Through the window, we saw Richard Sterling arguing heatedly with the surveyor, pointing repeatedly at a map, then jabbing a finger aggressively towards my house. Something's not right with their plan, Kevin observed shrewdly. They look rattled. Dad's phone buzzed. He checked the screen, and the barest hint of a smile touched his lips. My department just ran some preliminary background checks on Richard Sterling, Barbara Sterling, and your esteemed Sheriff Brody. Some interesting connections are already popping up. Like what? I asked, leaning forward eagerly. For starters, Richard Sterling worked for Maplewood Developers for 6 years before suddenly leaving to become a community leader here. The very same company that submitted those condo plans, Dad revealed. And guess who Sheriff Brody's campaign treasurer is? Richard Sterling's brother-in-law. The pieces weren't just clicking anymore. They were slamming together with the force of a battering ram. A sharp knock at the front door interrupted us. I peered through the peephole. It was Richard Sterling himself, flanked by 2 stern-looking men in expensive, ill-fitting suits. They looked like bulldogs stuffed into tailored clothes. Don't tell them who I am, Dad whispered again, quickly removing his visible badge and tucking it discreetly into his pocket. He smoothed his uniform tunic. Let's see what they want first. I opened the door cautiously, planting my feet firmly in the entrance, blocking their way. Can I help you, Richard? Richard pasted on that false, oily smile that never reached his eyes. We need to discuss an urgent matter regarding your property's structural integrity. My lawyer has advised me not to speak with you directly without him present, I stated, repeating the mantra my lawyer had drilled into me. This isn't optional, Richard replied, his smile vanishing instantly, replaced by a hard glint. These gentlemen, he gestured to the suits, represent Maplewood Developers. They have concerns and require immediate access to inspect your foundation. One of the suits stepped forward, his voice smooth but firm. We have reason to believe there might be structural issues that could potentially affect neighboring properties, including future developments. You need a court order for that, I countered, trying to keep my voice from shaking. This is private property. Actually, the second suit interjected smugly, the HOA covenant you agreed to gives us the right of entry for necessary safety inspections. Section 8, Paragraph 4. Dad appeared silently behind me, suddenly filling the doorway. That specific section, he stated calmly, but with unshakable authority, refers explicitly to common areas owned and maintained by the HOA, not private residences or their foundations. I've read your covenant very carefully. Richard's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing Dad with open suspicion. And you are? A family friend, Dad replied easily, projecting an air of helpful neighborliness. Just helping out with some home repairs. Richard studied him for a long moment, clearly unconvinced, but momentarily thrown off balance. He decided to press on. Whatever. The fact remains, we need access. Today. No, I said simply, channeling some of Dad's resolve. Then we'll just get Sheriff Brody to escort us in. Richard threatened, playing what he thought was his trump card. Oh? Dad asked, raising an eyebrow slightly. On what grounds? Obstruction of a necessary safety inspection, Richard snapped, losing his composure. Interesting, Dad mused, his tone deceptively mild. Is the sheriff now in the habit of enforcing speculative civil HOA matters rather than actual criminal law? Richard's face started to redden with fury. Who exactly are you? He demanded. Before Dad could answer, a white van with a local news station logo pulled up across the street. A reporter, Megan Riley, and a cameraman quickly got out, surveying the unfolding drama in my front yard. What's this now? Richard muttered, clearly flustered by the unexpected media presence. Kevin suddenly appeared beside the news crew, pointing discreetly but unmistakably toward my house. The reporter, Megan Riley, nodded eagerly and started heading straight towards us, microphone in hand. Richard panicked. We'll continue this discussion later, he said quickly, practically shoving his associates back towards their car and making a hasty retreat. You called the news? I asked Dad, incredulous. No, Dad said, a flicker of amusement in his eyes, but I think your friend Kevin has excellent instincts. The reporter, Megan Riley, approached, her microphone ready. I'm Megan Riley from Channel 7 News. We received an anonymous tip about homeowners potentially being forced out of their properties for a large development project. Would you be willing to comment on what's happening here? I glanced at Dad, who gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. Actually, Megan, I replied, stepping forward into the camera's view, my voice suddenly clear and strong. I'd be happy to show you exactly what's happening here. For the next 20 minutes, I walked Megan Riley through everything. I showed her the stakes hammered deep into my yard, the remnants of my destroyed garden, the ridiculous violation notice, the threatening cease and desist order, and finally, the glossy architectural rendering of the condos slated to replace my home. I detailed the suspicious new survey, Sheriff Brody's involvement, and the updated documents I'd never been notified about. The camera captured it all. And who authorized these sudden property line changes? Megan asked, her pen flying across her notepad. Sheriff Brody signed off on the paperwork pushed through by the HOA, I explained carefully, and coincidentally, his re-election campaign received a significant 5-figure donation from the HOA's Special Projects Fund just last month. Megan Riley's eyebrows shot up. Do you have documentation to support that claim? I nodded grimly. I do, and much more. Just as the interview began wrapping up, Barbara Sterling emerged from her house, marching across her perfect lawn towards us like a fury unleashed. What do you think you're doing? She shrieked, her voice vibrating with rage, directed at me but playing to the camera. You can't talk to the media. That violates HOA rules about public disparagement. Freedom of speech isn't subject to HOA approval, ma'am, Dad commented mildly from the edge of the frame, his presence undeniable even in the background. Megan Riley, sensing more drama, immediately turned her microphone towards Barbara. Would you care to comment on the allegations that the HOA, under your husband's leadership, is improperly seizing private property for a commercial development deal? Barbara's face went chalk white, then flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. That's completely false. It's slander. We are simply enforcing community standards. She stammered. Then perhaps you wouldn't mind explaining these documents, I asked, holding up copies of the Maplewood development plans bearing Richard Sterling's signature, which I'd printed earlier. Barbara's expression transformed instantly from flustered denial to pure, unadulterated fury. You will regret this, she hissed, venom dripping from every word, before spinning around and storming back to her house, slamming her front door hard enough to rattle the windows. As the news van drove away, Dad's phone rang again. His expression grew serious, almost stony, as he listened intently. That was my contact at the county records office, he said after hanging up, his voice grave. The property line changes for your lot, and several others, were indeed pushed through improperly, without the required public review period or proper notification. He paused, letting the weight of the next piece of information sink in, and guess who notarized the fraudulent documents? He didn't wait for an answer. Sheriff Brody's wife. Isn't that completely illegal? I gasped. Highly. Dad confirmed grimly. Conflict of interest, aiding fraud, the list goes on. But here's something else my contact found. The Maplewood development plans. The ones they filed under community improvement. They require a minimum footprint of 5 contiguous properties to make the project financially viable according to the submitted prospectus. Yours is just the first domino they needed to fall. Just then, Kevin's phone chimed with a notification. He looked down, his eyes widening in alarm. Guys, Richard just called another emergency HOA meeting. For tonight, members only, mandatory attendance noted. Dad smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the sharp, cold smile of a predator closing in. Perfect timing, he murmured. I think it's time Sheriff Brody, Mr. Sterling, and maybe even a few others learned exactly who they're really dealing with. As we began to formulate a plan for the evening's meeting, strategizing how to expose everything, my doorbell rang again. This time, it was a different courier, holding a stark white envelope marked urgent. Official notice. My blood ran cold as I opened it. Inside was a foreclosure notice. According to the document, laced with more dense legalese, I had allegedly failed to pay any HOA dues for the past 6 months, resulting in an automatic lien that was now being executed upon. They were claiming the right to seize my entire house. But I've paid every single month on time, I protested, scrambling to find my bank statements, the proof of automatic withdrawals clear as day. Look, they're falsifying financial records now, Dad concluded, his voice dangerously quiet. This is escalating fast. They're getting desperate. Kevin, who had instinctively moved to the window, suddenly stiffened. Guys, Sheriff Brody just pulled up again at Richard and Barbara's house, and, oh God, he's got official-looking eviction papers in his hand. I felt the blood drain from my face, a dizzying wave of fear washing over me. They're moving to evict me now, based on fake foreclosure? Dad put a firm, steadying hand on my shoulder. Don't worry, sir, he said, his voice hardening into steel. This is where their whole rotten plan falls apart. Because now, it's not just potential property theft or HOA violations. Now, it's official misconduct, mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, the list is long. He pulled out his phone, and this time, his chief's badge, holding it up slightly as he dialed. Who are you calling? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The State Attorney General's Office, Major Crimes Division, Dad replied, his voice deadly quiet. And after that, he added, his eyes glinting like chips of ice, my SWAT team commander. There is no way anyone comes to evict my child from their rightful home based on fraudulent documents, especially not a corrupt sheriff working for crooked developers. Kevin stared at Dad's badge, then back at the scene unfolding across the street, his mouth slightly agape. They really have no idea what's coming, do they? Dad's expression was stone cold, utterly implacable, as Sheriff Brody, flanked by a triumphant-looking Richard and Barbara Sterling, started walking purposefully across the lawn towards my front door, eviction papers held aloft like a trophy, not a clue. Dad answered grimly, but they're about to learn a very hard lesson about picking the wrong family to bully. The air crackled with tension as Sheriff Brody swaggered up my walkway, the fraudulent eviction notice held high. Richard and Barbara Sterling flanked him like malevolent shadows, their faces masks of triumphant greed. Brody didn't even bother knocking. He raised his fist to bang on the doorframe. Before his knuckles could connect, the door swung open. I stood there, flanked by Kevin, trying to project calm I didn't feel. Behind me, a figure stirred. "Sheriff Brody," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "you are attempting to serve an eviction notice based on deliberately falsified documents and fabricated claims of non-payment. This is illegal." Brody scoffed. "Got a judge's signature right here, missy. Looks perfectly legal to me. Now step aside." He made to push past me. Suddenly, Dad stepped fully into the doorway, blocking Brody's path. He held his phone loosely in one hand, his chief's badge gleaming prominently on his chest. His voice was dangerously quiet, yet it cut through the air like a razor. "Sheriff Brody, Chief Johnson, Riverdale County PD." Brody froze mid-step, his eyes widening in shock as he finally registered the uniform, the badge, the sheer authority radiating from my father. The color drained rapidly from his face. Chief Johnson, I didn't realize." "Clearly," Dad stated flatly, "you are currently standing outside your jurisdiction, attempting to enforce a fraudulent civil action based on falsified records, conspiracy to commit fraud, and blatant official misconduct. I just concluded a conversation with the State Attorney General's office regarding these matters." Richard Sterling's jaw dropped. Barbara gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "State? What is he talking about, Richard?" she hissed. "Furthermore, Sheriff," Dad continued, his gaze unwavering and bing-leng, "my SWAT commander is aware that one of my family members is being threatened with an illegal eviction by a potentially compromised law enforcement officer. I advised them to stand by, but their response time is under 5 minutes should you make any move that could be perceived as unlawful or threatening." Brody took an involuntary step backward, his bravado completely evaporating, leaving behind a residue of pure panic. "Now hold on, Chief. There must be some misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Dad cut in sharply, "was your assumption that you could abuse your power and conspire with individuals like Mr. Sterling here to defraud citizens of their property without consequence." As Dad spoke, 2 dark, unmarked SUVs pulled silently up to the curb, blocking in Brody's patrol car. Several serious-looking individuals in suits emerged. State investigators. They moved with quiet efficiency, their eyes scanning the scene, taking in Brody's uniform, the Sterling's panicked faces, the eviction notice still clutched in Brody's trembling hand. One of the lead investigators, a woman with sharp eyes, approached Dad and nodded respectfully. "Chief Johnson, we received your call regarding allegations of significant fraud and public corruption." She then turned her attention squarely to the sheriff. "Sheriff Brody, we need you to come with us to answer some questions regarding potential violations of state law, including conspiracy, bribery, and abuse of office in connection with Maplewood Developers and the Pinecrest Heights HOA. Her voice was calm, professional, and utterly final. Another investigator addressed Richard and Barbara Sterling, informing them they were also required for questioning. The neighborhood, drawn by the earlier commotion and the arrival of the police and news crews, had gathered at a distance. A collective gasp went through the small crowd as they watched their HOA president, his wife, and their sheriff being effectively detained by state authorities. Sheriff Brody sputtered, trying to regain some semblance of control. You can't. I'm the sheriff." "We can, and we are," the lead investigator replied coolly. "Perhaps you'd prefer to discuss this downtown?" 2 investigators quietly flanked Brody, their presence leaving no room for argument. Richard Sterling looked like he was about to faint, while Barbara began to weep hysterically, mascara tracking down her cheeks, shouting, "This is all your fault, Richard. I told you this was too risky." As they were escorted towards the state vehicles, separated from each other, Richard Sterling twisted around, his eyes locking onto mine across the yard. His face was a mask of pure hatred and fury. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear over Barbara's wailing. But the message, the venomous promise of retribution, was chillingly clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The investigators secured the fraudulent eviction notice and other documents as evidence. The immediate threat had passed, neutralized by Dad's swift action and authority. I sagged against the doorframe, relief washing over me, so potent it left me weak-kneed, yet tinged with the icy dread from Richard's parting glare. "It's not finished yet," Dad said quietly, echoing my thoughts as he watched the state vehicles pull away. "But we've taken away their primary weapon, local authority." He looked towards the HOA meeting notice Kevin still held. "Tonight's meeting just got a lot more interesting. They thought they could silence you. Instead, you're going to give everyone else a voice." He was right. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now overlaid with a burning determination. Richard and his cronies had underestimated me, underestimated my father, and underestimated the truth. Tonight, at that emergency meeting, the rest of the neighborhood was going to hear exactly what their HOA leadership had been doing behind closed doors. I still had the recording from my eavesdropping adventure the night before, the one detailing the kickbacks and the plot to have me arrested. It was time to bring everything into the light. "They changed your property lines on paper," my lawyer, Ms. Evans, confirmed later that day, sliding copies of the altered county documents across her polished desk. We'd met urgently after the morning's dramatic events. She tapped at strange digital markings, almost invisible timestamps embedded in the corners of the survey map. "See these? These alterations were digitally recorded just 3 weeks ago." They backdated the physical filings. My stomach knotted tighter. "That's impossible. My family has owned this exact plot with these boundaries for over 20 years. Miss Evans nodded, her expression grim. "Someone with high-level access is manipulating county records. It reeks of inside help, and there's more." She pulled up the financial disclosures I'd asked her to track down. Sheriff Brody received a $15,000 donation to his re-election campaign, funneled through the HOA's Special Projects Fund, just 2 days before he officially signed off on approving these new fraudulent surveys. I leaned forward, studying the damning papers, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. This was never ever about my tomato plants, was it? "No," she said, her voice low. She swiveled her monitor, pulling up a building permit application she'd unearthed. "Maplewood developers filed this last month. They're planning luxury townhomes across several contiguous properties right here in Pinecrest Heights, including," she zoomed in on the map, "the exact piece of your land that is now conveniently, according to their falsified documents, in dispute." The full, staggering scope of the conspiracy hit me. The HOA wasn't just power-hungry. It was a tool, a weapon, wielded by Richard Sterling and Maplewood developers, facilitated by a corrupt sheriff to steal homes. So the HOA isn't just trying to take my garden. They're systematically trying to force me, and likely others, out completely. Richard Sterling, and likely Sheriff Brody, and others stand to make a fortune if this development goes through, Ms. Evans confirmed. And based on these records and the speed at which they acted against you, he's clearly not acting alone. Outside her office window, the sky had opened up. Rain pounded against the glass, and thunder cracked overhead. The turbulent weather, a perfect mirror for the storm raging inside me. This was bigger, dirtier, and more dangerous than I could have imagined. Driving home from the lawyer's office, the rain still drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof, my mind raced. The evidence was damning, the corruption clear. But Richard Sterling's parting glare, that raw hatred, promised this wasn't just about legal battles anymore. He felt cornered, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. My phone rang, startling me. It was Dad. Just got off the line with an old partner, he said, his voice tight. He works in the county ethics department now. There's definitely a pattern here. 3 other homeowners right there in Pinecrest Heights have lost portions of their property to the HOA under highly suspicious circumstances within the past year. All part of this Maplewood development deal? I asked, watching the raindrops chase each other down my windshield, blurring the familiar streets into waterlogged shapes. Looks that way, Dad confirmed grimly. The previous targets? An elderly couple on a fixed income and 2 single parents. People they likely assumed couldn't afford lawyers or wouldn't have the resources or energy to fight back effectively. But why come after me so aggressively? I wondered aloud again. I'm not exactly the easiest mark. Dad's voice hardened. Maybe Richard Sterling got sloppy. Maybe he didn't bother to look too closely into your background, figure out who your father is. Or, he paused, maybe he's getting desperate. Maybe Maplewood is putting pressure on him to deliver those properties now. I stared through the rain at the brightly lit HOA community center ahead, lights blazing despite the late hour and foul weather. The emergency meeting was scheduled to start soon. Be careful tonight, Dad warned, his voice laced with professional concern. These people are already operating outside the law. That makes them unpredictable and dangerous. Kevin met me near the back entrance of the community center, rainwater dripping steadily from the brim of his baseball cap. Place is packed, he reported, his breath misting in the damp air. Whole neighborhoods turned out, buzzing about what happened this morning. Richard and Barbara are in there, looking like thunderclouds. They must have been released pending charges, or maybe the state guys are letting them dig themselves deeper. He glanced around nervously. No sign of Brody, though. We slipped inside. The main meeting room buzzed with tense energy. Neighbors stood in tight clusters, whispering, arguing, casting anxious glances towards the front, where Richard Sterling stood, flanked by the remaining loyal members of his board. He spotted me the instant I walked in, his face contorting into a mask of fury. Cameras flashed. Megan Riley and her crew from Channel 7 were already set up in the back, clearly tipped off about the potential fireworks. This meeting is for HOA members in good standing only, Richard sputtered, pointing a trembling finger first at me, then at the news crew. Press is not permitted. Perfect, I replied, my voice ringing out clear and steady despite the frantic hammering in my chest. I walked purposefully towards the front, clutching a folder filled with evidence and my laptop. Because I am still a member, Richard, and I, along with many other members here tonight, have some urgent business to discuss regarding the gross mismanagement and potential criminal activity of this board. Barbara, her face pale and drawn beneath layers of makeup, rushed towards me, her high heels clicking sharply against the worn linoleum floor. You can't just barge in here with cameras. This is private HOA business. Actually, Barbara, I said, raising my voice so everyone in the crowded room could hear clearly, this community center was built and is maintained with our dues. It belongs to all of us. I nodded towards the camera operator, and tonight, I think everyone deserves to see exactly what's been happening behind closed doors with our money and our property rights. The room fell silent, all eyes on me. Many neighbors looked confused, some angry, others hopeful. I recognized faces who had previously averted their gaze, people who had likely suffered from Richard and Barbara's petty tyrannies but had been too intimidated to speak up. Now, before anyone thinks about calling Sheriff Brody for backup, I announced loudly, letting the silence stretch for a beat, you should probably know he, along with his wife, is currently answering some very pointed questions down at the State Attorney General's office regarding bribery, fraud, and official misconduct. A collective gasp went through the room. I took a deep breath, connected my laptop to the overhead projector, and clicked the first slide. The screen lit up with scanned copies of bank statements. These, I explained, my voice amplified slightly by the room's acoustics, show a clear pattern: large sums of money moving from Maplewood developers into our HOA's Special Projects Fund, and then almost immediately being transferred directly into Richard and Barbara Sterling's personal accounts. More gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman in the back stood up abruptly. "Is that why they suddenly claimed my back fence, the one that's been there for 30 years, was encroaching on community property last month? And why they tried to fine me $2,000 for my garden gnomes?" called out another angry voice from the side. Richard Sterling lunged towards my laptop, his face purple with rage. "This is slander! Lies! You've doctored these documents!" Dad, who had entered quietly and taken a position along the side wall, stepped forward smoothly, blocking Richard's path. His presence, calm and authoritative, instantly commanded attention. "As chief of police from the neighboring county," he stated clearly, his voice resonating through the room, "I can personally verify that these financial records were obtained legally through official channels and are authentic." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. "Furthermore, the State Attorney General's office has been investigating similar schemes involving development companies, HOA boards, and compromised local officials across 3 counties. His words landed like hammer blows in the stunned silence. Barbara Sterling's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She turned on her husband, her voice shrill with panic. "Richard handled all the money. The accounts. I didn't know anything about any kickbacks, I swear." Richard's face twisted with fury. "Shut up, Barbara!" he hissed savagely. He turned back to the crowd, desperation etched onto his features. These are necessary development funds for community improvements, for, like, the improvement of your new vacation home in Florida, perhaps?" I asked, clicking to the next slide. It showed property deeds and purchase documents for a luxury condo on the Gulf Coast. Dated the same week, a payment of $175,000 landed in their account from Maplewood via the HOA fund. A wave of angry shouts erupted from the neighbors. Just then, a figure stood up from where she had been sitting quietly, almost unnoticed, in a corner of the room. It was the lead state investigator from that morning. "We've been building this case for months," she announced, her voice cutting through the noise. "Thank you, Ms. Johnson," she nodded towards me, "for gathering everyone involved and quite a bit of compelling evidence, conveniently in one place." As if on cue, 2 uniformed state police officers appeared at the main doorway. The crowd instinctively parted as they walked purposefully towards the front of the room. "Richard Sterling, Barbara Sterling," the investigator announced formally, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of a public official, embezzlement, and multiple counts of abuse of power." Chaos erupted. People surged forward, shouting questions, demanding answers, sharing their own stories of HOA harassment with newfound boldness. Kevin appeared at my side, handing me a thick stack of papers. "Emergency petition to dissolve the current HOA board and appoint an interim committee," he explained breathlessly. "I've been collecting signatures quietly for weeks. After tonight, we definitely have more than enough." As the state troopers escorted a handcuffed, stunned Richard Sterling towards the door, he twisted around, his eyes finding mine through the throng. He leaned towards me, his voice a venomous whisper that only I could hear over the din. "You think you've won? You have no idea who you're really dealing with. Maplewood's owner plays much, much bigger games than this. Your little victory won't last till morning. A chill, colder than the rainy night outside, ran down my spine as I watched them haul him away. What did he mean? Who was Maplewood's owner? What bigger games was he talking about? My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Parking garage, downtown. Level 3. Now, information about Maplewood owner you need to see. Come alone. My heart hammered against my ribs. Was it a trap or a genuine offer of help? I looked across the chaotic room at Dad, who was calmly helping the state investigator coordinate with the neighbors, trying to bring order to the pandemonium. Should I tell him about the text? Or should I take the risk and see what this mysterious informant had to share? The mention of the owner, after Richard's threat, felt too crucial to ignore. Richard's venomous whisper echoed in my ears, drowning out the chaotic energy of the room. Bigger games won't last till morning. The cryptic text suddenly felt less like a potential trap and more like a vital lifeline. Dad was needed here, organizing, reassuring the shaken residents. This lead, this potential key to understanding the true architect of my neighborhood's woes, felt like something I needed to pursue myself, quickly and quietly. With a deep breath stealing my nerves, I slipped out a side door unnoticed amidst the commotion. Rain still lashed down as I raced towards the downtown parking garage mentioned in the text. My hand trembled slightly as I pulled out my phone, quickly typing a message to Dad. Heading downtown parking garage, level 3, tip Maplewood owner. Going alone, seems urgent, will update. I hit send, a small measure of insurance, then shoved the phone deep into my pocket. The parking garage was eerily empty, a concrete tomb echoing my footsteps. Each level I ascended felt colder, more isolated. The air hung heavy with the smell of damp concrete and exhaust fumes. Reaching level 3, I scanned the dimly lit space. Rows of empty parking spots stared back like vacant eyes. Then, a figure detached itself from the deep shadows behind a thick support column. As I approached cautiously, the figure stepped into the weak fluorescent light. My breath caught. It was Ms. Peterson, Richard Sterling's harried, perpetually nervous assistant from the HOA office. Her eyes darted nervously around the cavernous empty level, emphasizing our isolation. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. She thrust a small USB drive into my hand. "I've been keeping records, copies of everything Richard tried to delete." Her words tumbled out in a frantic rush. "Maplewood, it isn't just some local development company. They're a front. They're buying up HOA board members, manipulating zoning, seizing properties for pennies on the dollar all across the state. It's huge." Her voice shook violently now. "The real owner, the one pulling all the strings, it's State Senator Albright." My stomach plummeted. State Senator Albright, a powerful, influential figure, chair of the state's powerful Zoning and Development Oversight Committee. No wonder Richard had been so confident, so arrogant. He had political cover at the highest levels. "There's more," Ms. Peterson continued, her eyes wide with fear. "They're planning to build..." Screech! The violent sound of tires tearing around a corner echoed up the garage ramp. Headlights swept across the concrete walls, pinning us momentarily in their glare. "Oh God, they followed me," Ms. Peterson gasped, genuine terror flooding her face. "He must have known I had copies. You need to go, now. Get that drive to someone who can use it." I didn't hesitate. Clutching the precious USB drive, I sprinted for the nearest stairwell. Behind me, I heard car doors slamming open, heavy footsteps pounding on the concrete, angry voices shouting. Adrenaline surged through me. Down the echoing stairwell I flew, my heart hammering against my ribs. Fumbling with my phone as I ran, I managed to type a single, frantic text to Dad. SOS, garage Senator Albright, involved, get help. Bursting out onto the rain-slicked street level, gasping for air, I didn't know which way to turn. Then, miraculously, the unmistakable flashing blue and red lights of multiple squad cars flooded the street, sirens suddenly erupting. Dad's dark SUV screeched to a halt right in front of me. He practically leaped out, his face grim, scanning the area before pulling me towards the safety of his vehicle as uniformed officers began securing the parking garage exits. He must have been on his way the moment he got my first text. 20 minutes later, back in the relative safety of my own living room, the chaotic energy of the HOA meeting replaced by the tense silence of disbelief. Dad paced the floor while I connected the USB drive to my laptop. Kevin, who had arrived shortly after us, peered over my shoulder. This is bigger than any of us thought," Dad said grimly, his voice low. The files on the drive laid bare the entire rotten conspiracy. It wasn't just Pinecrest Heights, it was statewide. Falsified surveys, meticulously documented bribes funneled through shell corporations to county officials and HOA board members in 3 counties, forged property documents, intimidation tactics. It was all there. Most shocking, however, was a detailed master plan map. It showed Pinecrest Heights, my entire neighborhood, completely erased, replaced by architectural renderings of an exclusive, sprawling private resort and golf course complex. Senator Albright's signature appeared on internal memos approving the less-than-legal strategies. "They weren't just after your garden or those 5 lots," Kevin breathed, horrified, looking at the map that obliterated his own home along with mine. "They wanted everything, our entire neighborhood." Dad stopped pacing and picked up his phone again. "My friend at the FBI needs to see this immediately," he stated, his voice heavy with the gravity of the situation. "This crosses county and state lines. We're talking major federal corruption charges now." The dam finally broke 3 days later. News exploded across the state. Following tips originating from the state AG and Dad's FBI contact, federal agents simultaneously raided Senator Albright's statehouse office, his home, and the gleaming corporate headquarters of Maplewood Developers. Boxes of documents were seized, computers confiscated. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of serious federal time, Sheriff Brody quickly agreed to testify against everyone involved in exchange for potential leniency. Richard and Barbara Sterling, already facing state charges, now found themselves indicted on multiple federal felony counts. But the arrests, the indictments, they weren't the clean victory I'd imagined. Revenge, I discovered, wasn't sweet. It was utterly exhausting. The following weeks blurred into a draining cycle of interviews with investigators, meetings with prosecutors, and preliminary court appearances. Anonymous threats started appearing. Vague messages slipped under my door, unsettling late-night calls with only silence on the other end. Someone slashed my tires twice. "You could stay at my place just until this blows over," Dad suggested gently after a particularly tense hearing where Senator Albright's high-powered defense attorney tried relentlessly to paint me as a vindictive liar, a neighborhood troublemaker with a personal vendetta. "No," I replied firmly, meeting his concerned gaze. "This is my home. They tried to take it, and they failed. I won't be scared away now." That night, something shifted. Neighbors I barely knew, people who had watched the initial drama unfold from behind their curtains, started appearing. An informal protection detail materialized, organized quietly by Kevin. They took shifts, discreetly watching my house, walking their dogs at odd hours, letting their presence be known. Kevin called another community meeting, not in the HOA center, but in a neighbor's large backyard. This time, People didn't just whisper, they shared. Story after story tumbled out. The elderly couple who'd been forced to tear down their beloved deck after decades. The single mum fined thousands for an unapproved fence that predated the HOA's very existence. The collective anger and relief coalesced into something new. Resolve. We need to rebuild, I told the group gathered under the string lights, the earlier fear replaced by a shared sense of purpose. Differently this time. No more petty tyrants on the board, no more ridiculous rules designed to intimidate. Transparency, fairness, community. The trial against Senator Albright, the Sterlings, and the other implicated officials lasted 4 grueling months. When the verdicts finally came back, guilty on nearly all counts, the wave of relief I expected didn't quite materialize. Instead, I felt oddly empty. Justice, it seemed, didn't immediately heal the fractures in our divided community or erase the scars of the ordeal. The real turning point came unexpectedly during the first tentative warmth of the spring thaw. I was struggling alone in my yard, trying to clear away the last remnants of winter storm debris, feeling overwhelmed and isolated despite the legal victory. A car pulled into my driveway, one I didn't recognize. Barbara Sterling's oldest daughter got out, looking hesitant. "Mom asked me to give you this," she said quietly, avoiding my eyes, handing me a sealed envelope. Inside, tucked away from the world under house arrest while awaiting sentencing, Barbara had written a letter in a surprisingly unsteady hand. "I was wrong," it read. "My greed, my pride, my desire to keep up appearances. It destroyed lives, including my own and my family's. I know this doesn't fix anything, but the community garden you're planning, I'd like to donate our yard for it. The part adjoining yours. It won't make up for what we did, but maybe it's a start." 2 months later, I pushed a wheelbarrow laden with rich, dark topsoil across what had once been the fiercely disputed boundary line between my property and the Sterlings. The soil was ready for planting. All around me, neighbors worked together, laughing, sweating, sharing tools and stories. They were breaking ground, not just in the earth, but in the foundations of their relationships, creating what would become the Pinecrest Community Garden. Kevin approached with a group of excited kids carrying trays of seedlings. "The elementary school wants to help plant the vegetables section," he explained, beaming. "They're learning about where food comes from." I paused, leaning on my shovel, and watched the scene unfold. Former enemies now worked side by side. Mrs. Abernathy, who had once formally reported my wind chimes as a noise violation, was now patiently helping Mr. Garcia install irrigation lines. The family who had threatened to sue me over the placement of my compost bin was now enthusiastically managing the new shared community compost program. Dad arrived later that afternoon, arms loaded with pizzas for the volunteer workforce. He stood for a long moment, surveying the bustling, collaborative scene, the turned earth, the shared purpose, the genuine smiles. "In 30 years of law enforcement," he said quietly, coming to stand beside me, "dealing with the aftermath of crime and conflict, I've never seen justice look quite like this." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. True justice wasn't solely about punishment or legal victories. It was about rebuilding, restoring, reconnecting. It was about healing. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and purple, someone suggested we all gather for a photo. Standing there together, shoulder to shoulder with my neighbors, surrounded by newly turned earth and the hopeful promise of freshly planted seedlings, I realized we had inadvertently created something revolutionary in its simplicity. A community where boundaries still existed on paper, but were no longer barriers between people. "Next weekend," called a voice from the back of the group. "My place, barbecue to celebrate our first planting." Cheers and agreements erupted as neighbors who, just months ago, might have avoided eye contact, now eagerly made plans to break bread together. Later, as twilight deepened and the first fireflies began their hesitant dance above the nascent garden, Kevin and I sat quietly on my porch steps, watching the lights blink on in neighboring houses. "You know," Kevin said thoughtfully, breaking the comfortable silence, "in a weird way, Richard Sterling accidentally created the one thing he probably feared the most." "What's that?" I asked. He smiled, a genuine, warm expression. "A neighborhood where property lines don't really matter anymore, because now we're all actually watching out for each other." I looked out at the peaceful street, at the mingling sounds of evening routines, and realized he was absolutely right. In their ruthless attempt to divide and conquer, our adversaries had unwittingly forged an unbreakable bond between us. The imposing, official HOA sign at the entrance to our neighborhood had recently been taken down. In its place stood a simple, hand-carved wooden marker, "Pine Crest Heights, growing together." This story serves as a powerful reminder that corruption and greed thrive in silence and division. But when ordinary people find the courage to speak up, gather evidence, and stand together, they can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. True community isn't just about living near each other, it's about actively looking out for one another, challenging injustice, and choosing collaboration over conflict. Even deep wounds can heal, and broken trust can be rebuilt, sometimes leading to something even stronger and more resilient than before. Have you ever faced a situation where you felt powerless against a system or authority figure? What are your experiences with HOAs or community disputes? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. We learn best when we learn from each other. And if you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more narratives about resilience, justice, and the power of community.